Hello and welcome. So, last time we talked about the Americas before the arrival of Europeans, and we discovered that the Americas were a hemisphere that was full of diverse people. We don't know exactly how many people. Historians and archaeologists like to speculate maybe 40 million, maybe 60 million, maybe even 100 million. And these people spoke a variety of languages, and as we saw last time, over the course of thousands of years, many of them were successful in making lots of environmental adaptations. So today I want to think about how the Americas changed with the arrival of Columbus. First, though, I want to briefly talk about Columbus's legacy and how that has changed over time. We're still sort of in the midst of this big debate about how or if we should celebrate Columbus or Columbus Day. And if we just look at two particular celebrations of the holiday, so the 400th anniversary and what that looked like, and how did it look differently when the 500th anniversary rolled around. And so in 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Atlantic world, teachers, poets, religious figures, lots of people utilized Columbus Day's patriotic rituals to advocate for the importance of loyalty to the nation and celebrate the United States' social and economic progress. Benjamin Harrison, who was president at the time, declared the first national holiday. This was seen as a way to celebrate unity and diversity at the time. If you know anything about late 19th century American history, you might know that this is when lots of Italian Americans were coming into the United States. We have lots of Italian immigrants coming here, and this was a way for them to celebrate their heritage and connect with the larger, native United States population. So there was even an exposition to celebrate Columbus. And this expedition was so big, so long in its preparation, that it actually didn't happen until the next year in 1893. And it's what becomes known as the Columbian Exposition. And it opens in Chicago. And over the course of a single year, there were something like 27 million visitors. And there were life-size reproductions of Columbus's ships, and there were parades and so forth. And this was a really big deal. If we fast forward 100 years to 1992, much more recent history, the reception, the idea of how to celebrate this holiday was to some extent in question. Native Americans in particular were moved to rally, to protest against celebrations that sort of blindly praised Columbus. And so there was supposed to be a big parade in Washington, D.C., but it turned out to be canceled very abruptly in the face of vows from American Indians and their supporters that they were going to disrupt the procession. There were demonstrators carrying signs that said, "Let's not celebrate an invasion," or "United States out of North America." And it seems like in some ways every year since then has been a referendum on how to celebrate Columbus. And this is sort of, as probably many of you know, spilled over into debates about what we should do with these Columbus statues. Many of them have been vandalized around the country. You can see in this particular one, somebody painted Columbus's hands red. And there has been debates about whether or not we should take these statues down. Some states don't even recognize Columbus Day. States with large indigenous populations, Hawaii, Alaska, Oregon, South Dakota, and other places, have replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day. And you might be aware that in 2021, President Biden, for the very first time, uh, made a proclamation about Indigenous Peoples Day. He also made a proclamation about Columbus Day, but this is a step forward for sure for people who would like to see a shift in focus on this particular holiday. So, as we start to think about Columbus, I want to, sort of take us back into this time period. So we saw what the Americas were like in the years before 1492, but let's think about Europe. What was Europe like in 1491 and before? Well, I think in some ways it's probably fair to say this was a second-rate region. That's not to say that it didn't have its own successes, its own kind of things to brag about, for instance. But it had some flaws, some real deep flaws in some ways. And I think, we could say that this was a place that was culturally and intellectually stagnant, for instance. For about 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, there is a shift. There's a real shift away from the acquisition of knowledge. People become deeply religious, and they tend to focus more on an afterlife. They tend to focus on, the will of God, as opposed to being curious about the world in which they live. People didn't really find the need to make their lives more comfortable. They were kind of the mind that their time here on earth was going to be brief. In reality, they thought they had to prepare for an afterlife that would stretch into eternity. So God had revealed to them everything they needed to know. So that was part of it. This is also an agricultural society. Again, the likes of which the economic system, the social system, has been around for something like 1,000 years. And then built into this agricultural system is deep, deep social inequality. There's a handful of feudal lords that are still controlling most of the land and the labor of the peasants, who are basically forced or compelled to work on this land. So this is a society that has its flaws. That's not to suggest that the Americas were a paradise. Certainly, the Americas had their own share of violence and inequality, and as we saw, perhaps overstepping one's bounds in particular civilizations. And in a way, Europe has some similarities. Both of these societies, I think it's best not to think of one as superior to the other. They just evolved in their own unique ways. We can also talk about Spain in particular. Well, actually, before we get to that, I should say a few things about life. This was a population where certain diseases were endemic, which means they just would pop up routinely. They never completely went away. So smallpox, for instance, measles, bubonic plague, these took an enormous toll on Europe. And of course, before the invention of antibiotics, probably something like half of all children died before the age of 5. It was not unusual for families to lose multiple children to these diseases at a young age. And of course, there was the Black Death, right? This outbreak of the bubonic plague between 1347 and 1353 that might have killed 1 in 3 of every Europeans. So Europe 150 years later is still not entirely recovered from that. And economically speaking, then, Europe also is somewhat stagnant. It's bottled up by what's known as the Muslim stranglehold. Until the 15th century, the Muslims controlled the trade routes to the east, right? Europeans were looking to acquire exotic goods like spices, like silk from the Far East in Asia. But in order to get there, they have to travel through the Middle East. And of course, the Muslims are controlling these trade routes, and this, to some extent, drives up prices. And it doesn't help that the goods that Europeans have to offer are goods that people in the East aren't particularly interested in. Wool and cloth, for instance. Those are goods that don't really have a lot of use for clothing manufacture in warmer climates. And so in the 15th century, though, we do start to see Europe turn a corner. And 1492 is a significant year for a couple of reasons. We can start to see a change of attitude, to be sure. You probably are familiar with the Renaissance. And again, this is not a term that people in this time period would have used, but this is how historians have sort of characterized this period, where we see a changing mindset, right? Where people become more focused on the here and now, where people become more focused on investigating the world around them, on, to some extent, living for this life. So that change in outlook allows for people to wonder what's out there beyond, the Atlantic Ocean. Is it possible to make one's way around the globe via a water route? And so 1492, the first significant event that happens in 1492 happens in January of 1492, and that is what becomes known as the Reconquista. And this is when Spain, which has been dominated by a people known as the Moors from North Africa, they were Muslim. They've been there for several hundred years, and Christians in Spain have been fighting this long war to basically kick them out. And finally, in January of 1492, they're successful. Under the reign of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spaniards are finally able to end Muslim dominance in Spain. And so what this means then is that Spain is now free to pursue other economic ventures, right? They can look outside of their own backyard. They can look for new trade routes to Asia. And Portugal has already had something of a head start in this regard. It's sent out explorers to explore the west coast of Africa. They've colonized islands in the Atlantic Ocean like the Azores and the Madeiras. And these islands become top producers of sugar and are also reliant on slave labor, which we'll have a lot to say about later on. But eventually, Vasco da Gama makes it all the way around the tip of Africa to India in 1498. And so, of course, that's after Columbus, but the Portuguese are the first to find this all-water route to India, and that is a major accomplishment. So Spain is in the middle of watching Portugal's success, but they want to find their own trade routes to the Indies. And contrary to what you've heard, most educated people did not think the world was flat in, say, the 1400s. In reality, most people were simply uncertain of how long it would take to sail east in order to get to Asia. Now, Columbus, when he's making his pitch to various rulers to finance his journeys, says, it's a relatively short journey. We sail to the east and we get to the west. And he thinks that, it's doable. And he convinces Ferdinand and Isabella to back him. And so Columbus, after 33 days at sea, lands in what we think was the Bahamas. However, as you probably know, he thinks he's off the coast of India. He thinks he's in the East Indies. And some people would argue he goes to his grave thinking that that's where he is, that still hasn't dawned on him and lots of others that there's this massive continent standing in their way. So Columbus immediately begins touting his discovery. The printing press helps spread the word. And of course, this language of discovery is a little problematic, knowing what we know now, that Columbus didn't discover anything because there were tens of millions of Native Americans living there. And often what you'll hear historians refer to at this time is the opening of the Atlantic world, right? This is the expression that we use nowadays, the idea that Europe and the Americas and Africa are ultimately connected together because of Columbus's accomplishments. So what did the Americas have to offer? Well, certainly they have lots of resources that Spain is interested in extracting, particularly gold and silver. And the question becomes, in some ways, how do we deal with these native peoples who we run into, who we encounter when we're there? How do we see them? And of course, Columbus's account, the letters he wrote back to Spain, are really, really illuminating in terms of showing us something about how Europeans viewed Native Americans. And the image that you have in front of you here as well, which I've asked you to analyze, to look at, and so forth, is this is an engraving. It was done within 100 years after Columbus, but what we need to keep in mind is that it's done by a man who has never seen the Americas, who's never set foot in the Americas. And while the figure here in this engraving is not meant to be Columbus, it's supposed to be Amerigo Vespucci, we do get a sense of how perhaps Europeans collectively thought about the Americas. I would just encourage you to look at this image. What does the body language between Vespucci and the native woman on the hammock tell us? Why do we have a woman here in the first place? Why are native peoples represented as a woman? Why is she lying on a hammock? What is going on in the background there at the fire? What does that tell us about European expectations about Native Americans? And what about the animals you see here? Do they remind you of any animals that you've actually seen before? Why is the artist drawing these animals the way that they are? So lots of things to talk about here. And I think this picture, in some ways, tells us just as much as, written accounts would tell us. But what we are left with is an encounter between two very different civilizations, two very different societies, right? Christian European societies versus native societies that are vastly different in their own right between one another. And did Europeans see them as equals? Did they see them as inferiors? Did they dismiss some of the things that they might have observed about their culture as simply superstitious or immaterial? So those are the kinds of questions that we kind of want to entertain here. And can we tell anything about how native peoples perceived Europeans too? This sometimes can come out if we read between the lines of, say, Columbus's account or other early explorers' accounts. If we try to, get past the prejudices of a particular journal writer, and we can instead see how these people perhaps reacted, or how they approached Europeans. But I think, given what we already know, probably what you've heard in other courses along the way, that Europeans are pretty dismissive. The Spaniards, that's who we're focused on right now. They in particular see these people as, in some ways, subhuman. They're not Christian. So that leads to the question of, do they have souls? And if they do not have souls, if there's no possibility of them going to heaven, then why not exploit them, right? Columbus comes back on his second voyage, and he enslaves 500 Indians. 600 more are enslaved on the island of Hispaniola today, where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. So this becomes a real question. There's lots of wealth to be had, but how is this wealth going to be acquired? And so Europeans are focused on extracting these resources, and they're willing to enslave Indians to do this. King Ferdinand himself, in 1511, instructs his subjects in the New World to quote, "Get gold humanely if you can, but at all hazards, get gold." So yeah, we should try to do it right. We should try to do it in a moral and judicious way, but the bottom line is, let's get the wealth here. And so there are people who watch this and people who are horrified by what they see, the enslavement, the warfare against native peoples, early on decimates the island of Hispaniola, right? We don't know how many people were there to start. There might have been 1 million, there might have been 8 million, but virtually all of them succumb either to warfare or disease or to brutality. And one of the people who notices this is a man by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. He comes from an interesting background. He was the son of a guy who had established his own plantation there. And de las Casas benefited from this estate there for a while. His father was a wealthy merchant. He gets rich on the island. Las Casas benefits from this. But gradually over time, he gets kind of anxious about the treatment. And in 1442, he writes a book called The Destruction of the Indies. And in that book, he basically chronicles all of the terrible things that Europeans did to native peoples. And there are questions about if he's, completely and utterly accurate or not. Some people say he might have exaggerated things, but he talks extensively about casual violence and dehumanizing exploitation of these people. And so his writings cause quite the stir. They get the attention of Spanish royalty. Like I said, he talks about all of these horrible things that happen. You can see in the quote there that he talks about, basically hanging 13 native people at one time and setting a fire under them. The illustrations that accompanied one early edition of his book, you see here in front of you now too. People smashing babies against trees and so forth, turning dogs loose to tear the flesh off of people. So this gets the attention of a lot of people. And eventually, the queen decides that the people who are friendly, that friendly Indians who adopt Christianity, who live in families, they can't be enslaved. But at the same time, she says they can be forced to pay tribute. And so, theoretically speaking, if you're a native person and you're willing to abandon your life ways, your customs, your religion, you can be treated well. At the same time, though, Spain suffers from a real shortage of labor. There's not a lot of people who are willing to come and work for nothing or close to nothing to the Americas and risk a lot in the process of getting there. So they need to have local workers. And so what comes out of this is what becomes known as the encomienda system. And this is just essentially slavery by another name. Spaniards compel Indians to work. They're still basically forced to work. But in exchange for their labor, they receive religious teaching. They receive education. And so in the process, then, the labor that they give is sort of the payment they receive for being shown the way to Christianity. So it's just like I said, slavery with a different name. And through this process, Spanish people commit lots of atrocities. First in the islands off the coast of the Americas, but later in places like Mexico and South America as well. So if we switch gears a little bit, and we can see that there were real dynamic changes that came about between the interactions of these cultures that had previously not encountered one another. But we also want to talk about other sort of implications as well. And what I'm trying to reference here is the idea of how biological and cultural change come about as a result of the exchange of goods and ideas across the Atlantic. And historians have come to think of this as the Columbian exchange. This was a term conjured up by a historian in the 1970s to basically talk about the biological and cultural exchange that takes place after Columbus's encounter in the Americas. And so if we stop and think about it, not only do you have people meeting people who have never met before, but you have now people who were introduced to plants and animals and germs that they had never come in contact with before. And what happens when you take, one of these, plants or animals or germs that evolved isolated for thousands of years in a particular environment, and now you place it in a new environment. And what we can see is there are enormous consequences. So if we think about plants, for instance, there are various plants that were known only in the old world that take hold in the Americas. Rice, wheat, barley, sugarcane, bananas, these are all old world goods, but they come to the Americas. I mean, if you think about bananas in this day and age, you think of them as a product of, South America, for instance, or just more generally, the Americas. On the other hand, corn, potatoes, tobacco, beans go the other way. Those were goods, those were plants, fauna, or flora that were created exclusively in the Americas. And so there are real implications. We introduce sugarcane to the Americas, and as we'll see, sugarcane is a crop that is extraordinarily important. It's extraordinarily lucrative, but it's also labor intensive. So you need people to work on these sugar plantations, and this is dangerous, grueling work. Who's going to do it of their own free will? And so we see perhaps Native Americans first being put in those positions. But as we'll see later on, there's a shift. Native Americans died off in a lot of cases. And so how do we replace them? Well, we start importing slaves from Africa. So we'll have a lot more to say about that later. But because of the explosion of this one old world plant in the New World, we see the emergence of a distinct labor regime that's going to have real implications over the course of centuries. And we also see major changes in the world's staple diet as well. Corn, now being consumed in Africa, for instance. The potato becomes a staple in the diet of Europe. And it was really revolutionary for farmers there. In the past, in Europe, if you grew, rye or barley, wheat, you had to leave part of your field fallow every year in order for it to rejuvenate, to regain the nutrients that it needs to support a particular crop. Well, now with potatoes in particular, you don't have to engage in this. You can engage in some sort of crop rotation. Potatoes are very productive. They offer a lot of calories. They're hardy. You don't really have to worry about weather too much with them. And they essentially double Europe's food supply. And what this allows is for a massive growth of population in Europe. Remember, here we are 150, 160 years still after the Black Death in Europe. The population levels are still depressed, but with the introduction of corn and particularly potatoes, Europe's able to feed itself now. You're not necessarily destined to have starvation years. And so this allows Europe's population to boom. And I think we could say is probably in some ways sets the foundation for European, or shall we say, Western dominance between, say, 1750 and 1950. So what about animals? So as we mentioned before, due to the Pleistocene extinction, a lot of those big mammals in the Americas were gone. There's nothing like a cow. There's no horses. We know like the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers, those sorts of creatures, ground sloths are all wiped out. And so there's very little choice for people in the Americas to domesticate animals. Very few large animals that can be domesticated. The largest would be the llama. That's the one that comes from the Americas. In the Old World, by contrast, over time, and this would have been, 10,000 years before in what we refer to as the Neolithic Revolution. Over time, people succeeded in domesticating cows and horses, pigs, and sheep. And so this means a lot not only for diets, for intensive work to have beasts of burden like horses or mules, but there's a downside as well. People living close to animals means that we see disease, people catching diseases that evolve from animals to people. Like, for instance, influenza, sometimes coming from animals like pigs, smallpox, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, chicken pox, the plague, scarlet fever. All of these are diseases that originated at one point with domestic animals and they jumped to people. And of course, Europe paid the price for this over the course of generations, over the course of centuries. These diseases became endemic in Europe, meaning they're constantly around. Again, if you were struck early enough in childhood, a lot of kids would have died, but if you survived, you have some degree of immunity, right? And so as a result, you would have more defense, and there is some sort of defense then sort of bequeathed to future generations as well. Well, Native Americans had never come in contact with any of these diseases before. No smallpox before the arrival of Europeans, no flu, no measles, no plague. All of these are brand new, and they take a devastating toll. We don't know, but smallpox in particular carried a devastating mortality rate. People would have this disease they'd never seen before. They would flee. It was highly contagious. It would infect other people. And there's some evidence that these diseases, like smallpox, actually proceeded along native trade routes. So in other words, there were native populations in places like, say, South America that had smallpox, like the Inca, it appears, had smallpox, perhaps before they'd ever even seen a Spaniard or a white person. These diseases traveled ahead, and they took, like I said, a devastating toll. And as a result, perhaps as much as 90% of the native populations in the Americas is wiped out within the first centuries or so of contact. And so that is a profound impact. So Europeans they don't really get too many animals from Europe, but I mean, something that we sort of think of as quintessentially American turkeys come um, from the Americas. But we can also think of how did natives interact with some of these animals once they actually came here. Settlers, colonists brought with them cows. They didn't bother to fence in cows or pigs, so these animals might have gotten into, native patches of corn or places where certain wild roots or berries were growing, and this led to tensions. We've seen wars break out over this sort of thing, where native peoples are upset of livestock destroying their land and their resources. But also, what about the horse? Native peoples did not have horses to hunt with, and when we think of tribes on the plains like the Lakota or the Comanche, it's hard to envision them now without horses, right? This was in some ways their golden age. This is what they would tell you. This was a time period when the introduction of the horse through the Spaniards revolutionized their hunting on horseback, made them even more successful buffalo hunters. And that was something that they looked on with pride. So I already kind of covered this part, I guess. The diseases, the microbes that spread, again, disease that started with animals and evolved, jumped to people. Those people who are now coming to the Americas are carrying with them smallpox, or carrying with them typhoid or measles. And so this eradicates maybe half, maybe even, as one historian in particular has suggested, up to 90% of the native population. So this takes a toll. So, I mean, we hear about the conquest of the Incas or the Aztecs, and Europeans at the time, they might have been willing to sort of chalk that up to their own superiority, their superior weapons, their belief in a superior God or the one true God or something. But in reality, native civilizations were deeply, deeply harmed by this onslaught of disease. It's not only if you caught the disease itself, but you can think about what happens when, you may not get the disease, but the people who procure food, or the people who are responsible for administering the community in which you live, the people who are responsible for, keeping the water supply clean, the people who are responsible for tending the ill. What happens when all of these people start to fall ill? Society starts to crumble, and that's what happens in countless societies again and again in the Americas. And so finally, what can we say about consequences here? Well, I mean, Spain obviously in some ways comes out as the big winner. It comes to dominate a territory that's 10 times bigger than the nation itself. So tiny Spain back in Europe, dominating an area that's bigger than ancient Rome. And they are very, very focused on wealth, gold and silver. Hernando Cortez, who was the conquistador who conquered Montezuma and the Aztecs, he becomes the wealthiest man in Spain next to the king. But of course, this wealth depends on enslaving native populations, putting them into work in fields, harvesting sugarcane, putting them into work in mines in places like what will become Bolivia or Peru, or even in Mexico. And they're relying on the encomienda system here, right? This form of enslavement that work becomes a tribute that you must engage in. And of course, this is also going to take a toll on the workers, on the native peoples. They're working in conditions that are absolutely miserable. They're unsafe. They're not given enough to eat. And so this leads to demographic collapse as well. And let's talk about the dynamic here of society that develops. You have mostly coming from Europe Spanish conquistadores who are single young men, right? They're not coming with their families. They're coming as soldiers or maybe administrators of plantations or that sort of thing. So they're on their own. And so what we see develop throughout the Spanish colonies is a society that blends together Spanish and Christian culture with native peoples and indigenous culture. And so we see sort of this blending together, not just in terms of, a sort of hybrid culture emerging, but also a hybrid race emerging as well. It's like we've come to think of, a class of society here as mestizo, right, or mixed, where you have Spaniards who are either marrying or other ways engaging in sexual relations with native women. And we see this class of people of mixed race who are neither entirely Spaniard nor entirely indigenous. And this comes to sort of dominate culturally. This is a sort of, racial dynamic that exists to this very day in Latin American countries. And we'll compare this to what later happens in English colonies, right? There's not the same level of mixing. There is more kind of, you stay on your side of the border, we'll stay on ours. We're not going to engage in sort of this same sort of mixing that occurs here, in part because many English people come with their families. Not all of them, but a significant portion, at least in some parts of the English colonies. But we'll talk about that more another time. But the last thing I want to bring up is really sort of controversial here when we talk about consequences. And this is something that's just come out in the last couple of years. There are a couple of scientists who maintain that the die-off in the Americas, the death of so many indigenous peoples, was so profound that we're talking about tens of millions of people dying within 100 years or so, that as a result there are fewer people, and the lack, and with fewer people to shall we say, cultivate the earth, we see the growth of more trees. More trees means soaking up of more CO2, which is actually cooling the planet. And so these scientists suggest that the climate change known as the Little Ice Age, when the planet started to get cooler in this time period, around the 1400s, it's going to last into the late 1700s, early 1800s, somewhere around in there, is actually brought on by this mass death in the Americas. Again, nobody's proved this. This is controversial, to be sure, but I think it's an interesting way to view things. In any event, though, this is a really significant moment. It's significant for lots of peoples, lots of cultures. So next, we'll turn our attention to the English colonies and how they interacted with Native Americans and how they chose to colonize particular locations like Virginia or New England. So we'll stop there for now, and we'll pick up again another time. So take care, and I'll see you again soon.